It happened in the 67th minute, the moment that would define more than just a single match. The North London derby was balanced on a knife's edge, Arsenal pressing forward with the aggression that had carried them through their title challenge, Tottenham sitting deep, waiting for the counter-attack that they believed would come. The Emirates Stadium was a cauldron of noise, the kind of roar that only happens when two clubs separated by a few miles and decades of rivalry face off with everything on the line. And in the middle of it all were two men whose names had become synonymous with Arsenal's resurgence. Two players who had rebuilt the club's midfield and defense from the ashes of mediocrity. Declan Rice, the captain with the weight of the season on his shoulders, and Bukayo Saka, the academy product who had become the club's future. By the 67th minute, a single mistake would tear them apart. By the tunnel, whispered words would turn brotherhood into silence. By the next morning, the entire Emirates would be holding its breath, wondering if Arsenal's title challenge could survive the fracture that had just opened up in its foundation. But it started with a question that Rice asked himself in that moment, a question that would lead to 7 words spoken in anger that he would spend weeks regretting. You're not ready for matches like this. Don't forget to subscribe to Elite Ball Legends and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The North London derby had always been Arsenal's stage to prove something, not just about football, but about identity, about who they were as a club, as a group of players willing to go to war for the shirt. This particular Saturday had felt different from the moment the squad arrived at the Emirates. The season was at a critical juncture, a point where title challenges were either reinforced or evaporated. Arsenal sat second, level on points with Manchester City, but with an inferior goal difference. Tottenham, sitting just below them, represented more than just a rival. They represented a chance to create separation, to send a message through the Premier League that Arsenal were serious, that this wasn't a flash of brilliance, but a sustained transformation. Declan Rice had captained Arsenal for the pre-match walk. He'd done it 100 times before, but on derby days, the responsibility felt different. His armband seemed heavier. His voice, when he spoke to the players in the tunnel, seemed to carry more weight. At 25 years old, he was the oldest outfield player in a squad that had been deliberately rebuilt with young talent. He had arrived at Arsenal as a proven midfielder, a player who had already experienced everything football could throw at him at West Ham. But captaincy was different. Captaincy meant bearing responsibility not just for his own performance, but for everyone else's. It meant knowing that when things went wrong, as they inevitably did, his words in this dressing room would matter more than anyone else's. Bukayo Saka, meanwhile, was feeling the weight of the occasion in a different way. At 22, he was one of the most technically gifted players in the league, a product of Arsenal's academy, who had developed into something special. The scouts from across Europe had their eyes on him. The commercial departments of the biggest clubs had their eyes on him. But on derby day, none of that mattered. What mattered was that this was Tottenham, and Tottenham was the enemy, and he was supposed to be the future of this club. He was supposed to carry the banner. He'd trained all week with a particular intensity, working on his positioning against fullbacks, refining his first touch, preparing for the moment when the pitch would be the stage and he would be expected to perform. The match itself had started as all derbies do, with edge, with intensity, with a physical quality that went beyond the tactical elements. Within the first 10 minutes, there had been 2 yellow cards, both deserved, both a signal that this was a match where nothing would be given freely. Arsenal had pressed high, forcing Tottenham into mistakes, winning the ball in dangerous areas. Saka had been involved in much of this, his pace and directness causing problems for the Tottenham left side, his movement creating space for others, his willingness to press meaning that Tottenham's build-up play was consistently disrupted. Rice, meanwhile, had been doing what Rice did best, controlling the rhythm of the match. He'd been positioned deep, in front of the back 4, intercepting passes before they became dangerous, his distribution quick and accurate, his positioning so intelligent that he seemed to always know where the ball was going before it arrived. This was the version of Rice that had convinced Arsenal to pay £90 million for him. Not the flashy version, not the version that made highlight reels, but the version that made everyone around him better, that made defending look simple because he did so much of the work before the danger materialized. But as the first half progressed toward its conclusion, something had shifted. Tottenham had started to grow into the match. Their fullbacks had begun to overlap more frequently. Their attacking transitions, when they came, had started to carry real threat, and in the 52nd minute, they had nearly scored when a through ball had found their striker in behind, forcing Aaron Ramsdale to make a save that reminded everyone that even the best defenses in the world existed on a knife's edge. Rice had been frustrated by that moment, not with his own positioning, but with the overall shape. The pressing had been too high. The defensive line had been too vulnerable to the quick counter-attack. By the 67th minute, Tottenham had found the rhythm they'd been searching for. They'd won the ball in midfield. A loose pass from Rice, actually, the kind of error that happens to even the best players when they're tired or slightly out of rhythm. And they'd moved it quickly to the left wing. Their left back had overlapped. Saka, the young Arsenal winger, had been tracking the run, but he'd been slightly too deep when the ball arrived. The Tottenham player had sent a low cross into the box, and their striker had been waiting, unmarked, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a fraction of a second. The shot had been saved by Ramsdale, but the rebound had fallen to a Tottenham midfielder lurking at the back post. He'd smashed it, and the ball had hit the back of the net with that sickening sound that every Arsenal supporter knew meant only one thing. Tottenham had scored. The roar from the Tottenham end had been deafening. The silence from the Arsenal supporters had been worse. And in that silence, Declan Rice had felt something crack inside him. Not just frustration at the goal, but something deeper. A question about whether this young team, this team of academy products and expensive acquisitions, was truly ready for the intensity of moments like this. What happened next had been Arsenal's response. They'd thrown everything forward, desperate to equalize, pressing with a frenzy that bordered on desperation. In the 75th minute, they'd gotten their reward. A corner kick had been delivered to the back post, and Gabriel Magalhaes had risen above everyone to head it past the goalkeeper. The Emirates had erupted. The comeback was on. The derby was alive again. But something had shifted in how Rice was seeing the match. He'd noticed something in Saka's positioning before Tottenham's goal, something that gnawed at him. In the 81st minute, with the score still 1-1 and the match entering its final stretch, Tottenham had broken forward again. Their right back had received the ball in space. Saka had been tracking the run, but he'd been slightly too narrow, covering the center of the pitch instead of staying wide. The full-back had cut the ball back, and it had found a midfielder arriving from deep. His shot had been blocked, but only just. For the second time in the match, it felt like Arsenal had gotten lucky, like they were surviving rather than controlling. And then, in the 84th minute, it had happened. A Tottenham attack down the right wing. Their winger had cut inside. Rice had come across to cover, but in doing so, he'd left space behind him. Saka was tracking his man, but again, he was slightly too narrow, slightly too worried about the center of the pitch. The Tottenham player had found space in exactly the right spot, and he'd played a ball into the box. The Tottenham striker had turned quickly, too quickly for the defenders to react, and he'd been brought down by Gabriel. The referee hadn't hesitated. Penalty. 90 seconds later, the penalty had been converted, and Tottenham had won the North London derby 2-1. The whistle had blown. The Emirates had erupted in fury. Tottenham's players had celebrated like they had won the title, and Arsenal's players had trudged toward the tunnel in silence, the weight of the loss pressing down on them like a physical force. This wasn't just any loss. This was a derby loss. This was a loss that could define the title race, could give Tottenham momentum, could undermine everything Arsenal had built this season. In the tunnel, as the players filed past each other in that strange liminal space between the pitch and the dressing room, Declan Rice had made a decision. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't something he'd consciously decided to do. But as Saka had walked past him, his head down, his shoulders slumped, Rice had reached out and pulled him aside. Not aggressively, just firmly, just enough to indicate that they needed to talk. The other players had continued past them, sensing the tension but not daring to intervene. And then Rice had spoken, his voice low but intense, his words clipped and direct. "You're not ready for matches like this. That's not me being cruel. That's me being honest." 7 words. 7 words that had been designed, in Rice's mind, as a wake-up call. A captain's truth-telling, the kind of thing that Rice believed he had a responsibility to do as the leader of the team. Saka was talented, incredibly talented. But in this match, against this level of intensity, against this kind of opponent, his positioning had been naive. His understanding of the tactical game had seemed to lag behind the physical and technical abilities. That was what Rice had been trying to communicate. But Saka had heard something different. He'd heard doubt. He'd heard a captain who didn't believe in him. He'd heard a leader who, in the moment of defeat, had chosen to blame him rather than looking at the bigger picture. The tactical system that had left them vulnerable. The overall defensive shape. The decision to press so high. All of it had converged in that moment, and Saka had felt it all directed at him, a young player trying his best in a match that was against one of the best teams in England. "That's all you have for me?" Saka had replied, his voice trembling slightly. "After everything I gave today, you're going to stand here and tell me I'm not ready?" Rice had opened his mouth to respond, to clarify, to explain that he was trying to help, that he was trying to make him better. But before he could speak, Saka had turned and walked away, disappearing into the dressing room. And in that moment, something had broken between them. The dressing room had been toxic in a way that is hard to describe unless you've experienced it. It's not shouting and anger, it's silence. It's the absence of the usual camaraderie, the missing banter, the conversations that don't happen because there's a fracture that's too big to ignore. The manager had addressed the team, had spoken about the penalty, about the decisions, about what needed to change tactically. But his words had felt hollow, like they were flowing over a group of players who were too fractured to listen. Over the following week, the silence between Rice and Saka had become the story. They didn't sit together on the team bus. They didn't speak in training. They didn't make eye contact. Other players had noticed. The media had noticed. Speculation had begun to fill the void. Was there tension between them? Had Rice blamed Saka unfairly? Was the captain failing to support his young teammate? The narrative had built and built, growing more dramatic with each retelling, each social media post, each pundit offering their interpretation of what might have happened in the tunnel. Arsenal's next match had been a home game against a mid-table team, a match they were expected to win easily. But the performance had been labored. The usual rhythm had been missing. Saka had played, but there had been no spark in his movement. Rice had played, but his usual control of the match had seemed distant, distracted. They'd won 2-1, but it could have been 5-1 on another day. After the match, the manager had been asked about the tension in the squad. He'd given a bland answer about professional focus, but everyone knew that something was wrong. By the third day after the derby, it had become clear that this wasn't just going to blow over. At training, the fracture had become wider. Rice had attempted to speak with Saka, but Saka had dismissed him, his body language closed off, his face set. Other players had tried to intervene, to bridge the gap, but neither man had been receptive. They'd simply retreated into their respective corners, each convinced that they were right, that the other had been unfair, that the bridge between them had become too damaged to repair. The manager had called them in for a mediation session. He'd tried to bring them together, to get them to articulate what had happened, to understand each other's perspective. Rice had explained that he was trying to help, that captaincy meant sometimes having difficult conversations. Saka had explained that he didn't need his captain doubting him, that what he needed was support, especially in moments when things weren't going well. But the conversation had gone in circles. Neither man had seemed willing to truly listen to what the other was saying. The manager had walked out of that meeting looking exhausted, the weight of the situation visible in every line of his face. Training in the following days had been tense. The team had gone through the motions, working on shape and transitions, preparing for their next match against Manchester United. But the usual fluidity had been missing. The interplay between the defense and midfield had seemed disconnected. Saka had been performing his role, but there was a hesitation in his movement, a sense that he was playing safe, that he'd retreated into himself. Rice had been barking out instructions more than usual, his voice carrying a note of frustration that the other players could sense. 2 weeks had passed, 2 weeks of silence, 2 weeks of the media speculation growing louder, 2 weeks of a team that should have been unified for a title push, becoming fractured by internal tension. Arsenal had won their next 2 matches, but the performances had been unconvincing. They'd dropped points to teams they should have beaten convincingly. Their attacking play, which had been their trademark, had become pedestrian, and through it all, the silence between Rice and Saka had persisted. It was on a cold Tuesday evening in the training ground corridors that something changed. Rice had been leaving after the day's training session when he'd found Saka waiting for him, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed but his face open, vulnerable in a way that Rice hadn't seen in weeks. For a moment, neither man had spoken. The silence between them had been heavy, laden with everything that needed to be said but hadn't been. "I've been thinking about what you said," Saka had begun, his voice quieter than Rice had ever heard it. "About the positioning, about not being ready." Rice had opened his mouth to respond, but Saka had held up a hand, asking for a moment more. "I was angry because I thought you were saying I wasn't good enough, that you didn't believe in me, but I've watched the footage, multiple times, and you were right. My positioning before their first goal was poor. I was too narrow. I was thinking too much about covering the center instead of trusting the system, trusting Gabriel and the defenders to deal with that space. And in the moment, I felt like you were attacking me instead of trying to help me. But I think maybe I needed to hear it that way. Maybe I needed someone I respect to tell me the hard truth." Rice had felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight for weeks. "I wasn't trying to make you feel like I didn't believe in you," Rice had said, and his voice had carried the genuine regret of someone who had made a mistake. "You're one of the best young players in the world. You know that. I know that. But in that moment, I was frustrated, and I let my frustration come out in a way that hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for not pulling you aside after, for not clarifying what I meant. That's on me as captain." "You were right, though," Saka had repeated, "about the positioning, about needing to be ready for these moments. And I've been thinking about it all week. I've been replaying every movement, every decision, trying to understand where I went wrong so I can be better next time. Because there will be a next time, and I want to be ready." Rice had stepped forward and put his hand on Saka's shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, the tension between them had shifted. It hadn't disappeared entirely. The scars from the tunnel, from the weeks of silence, from the questions and doubts were still there. But something had changed. There was an understanding now, a recognition that both men had been trying in their own way, that both had made mistakes, and that what mattered now was moving forward together. The match against Manchester United came 4 days later. From the first moment, the difference was visible. The fluidity was back. The understanding between defense and midfield had been restored. Saka had played with a freedom and a confidence that had been missing, his positioning sharp, his decision-making quick. Rice had been everywhere, controlling the rhythm, orchestrating the team, his voice clear and authoritative but also supportive, encouraging the young players around him, celebrating their good moments, pushing them to be better. In the 59th minute, Manchester United had given away a corner. The ball had been delivered to the back post, and it had fallen to Saka. He'd controlled it with his first touch, and with his second, he'd squared it back across the box where Rice had been arriving. Rice's shot had been blocked, but the rebound had fallen to another Arsenal player who'd buried it. As the celebrations had erupted, Saka and Rice had found each other in the crowd, and for just a moment, they'd made eye contact. There had been a nod. A small gesture, but one that contained everything that needed to be said. Arsenal had won 3-0 that night. More importantly, they'd played like a team that was united again, that understood each other, that was ready for whatever the season would throw at them. In the following weeks, the performances had gotten better. They'd climbed back to the top of the table. The title race had become genuinely competitive, with Arsenal and Manchester City trading positions, both playing with a level of consistency and quality that suggests this would be decided by the finest of margins. But something had changed in the relationship between Rice and Saka. They would never be as close as they had been before the derby. The incident in the tunnel had left a mark, and that mark would always be there. But what had emerged in its place was something perhaps more durable. A mutual respect, based not on the assumption of perfection, but on the recognition of each other's humanity, each other's capacity for mistakes and growth. Rice understood now that being a captain sometimes meant not just telling people the hard truth, but doing so with care, with follow-up, with the kind of emotional intelligence that turns a moment of criticism into a moment of growth. Saka understood now that being a young player at a big club meant being willing to hear difficult feedback, to process it, to use it as fuel for improvement rather than as an indictment of his ability. In the months that followed, in interviews and in press conferences, both men would be asked about the derby, about the tunnel, about what had happened between them. And both would give diplomatic answers, the kind that professional footballers give when they're protecting each other's reputation. They would say it was a learning experience. They would say it made them stronger. They would say that every team goes through moments of tension and that what matters is how you respond. And all of those things would be true, even if they were incomplete. What they wouldn't say, what would remain private between them, was the exact nature of the conversation in that corridor. They wouldn't describe the vulnerability that Saka had shown, leaning against that wall, admitting his own mistakes. They wouldn't detail the moment when Rice had realized that being a captain meant not just being right, but being kind in how you communicated those truths. They wouldn't share the conversations that had come after, the ones where they had discussed not just positioning and tactics, but life, pressure, the weight of expectation, and what it meant to be young and talented in a sport that demanded perfection while being impossible to achieve. But the impact of that conversation, that moment of genuine connection, would ripple through the season. Arsenal would finish in the top two. They would win the FA Cup. Most importantly, they would do it as a team that was unified, that believed in each other, that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that greatness is not just about individual talent, but about the willingness of talented individuals to support each other, to challenge each other fairly, and to grow together. Years later, when both men had moved on, when their careers had taken them to different places and different stages of their lives, they would still speak about that season, about the North London derby, about the tunnel. And they would both say the same thing, that the most important moment hadn't been the match itself, but the moment when they'd chosen to bridge the gap between them, to be honest about their mistakes, and to recommit to each other, and to the cause they'd been fighting for. Because that's what separates good teams from great ones. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to move through conflict with integrity and come out the other side stronger.